Welcome, everybody, to the webinar on navigating the pandemic. My name's Peter Levine. I'm from Tisch College, and I'm part of a team, but I'll introduce some others in a few minutes. Very excited to be in contact with all of you, including some of my own students who I miss and admire, including students from the class of 2020. So we're including some graduates, recent graduates in this program. Also current Tufts students, and then a bunch of incoming Tufts students who are just about to matriculate. So welcome so heartily to you, and other members of our community, including parents. So we welcome everybody to this conversation. This is being brought to you by Tufts University, but especially by the Tisch College of Civic Life. And especially for those of you who are new to Tufts, this might be your first real exposure to Tisch College. So please check us out for a lot of other activities and opportunities, tischcollege.tufts.edu. Hopefully you'll be involved with us your whole time at Tufts. When I stop talking in just a few minutes, I'm gonna hand things over to Deborah Donahue-Keegan, also from Tisch College, who really is the lead organizer and educator in this. And so I defer to her as the real leader, but I'm happy to kick us off. So just a few words from me to start. I wanted to say our goal is to help you and ourselves, honestly, to navigate the pandemic. And that means a lot of things. That can mean a lot of things. It definitely means obtaining reliable information and learning how to do that about the disease and about its consequences. Developing skills for emotional resilience in the face of trauma and uncertainty, skills that we all need. Strengthening connections with other people, including other people connected to this webinar. And then working to make the world better to address the social consequences of the pandemic, so civic engagement policy. We are acutely aware that the country has not only experienced a pandemic, but also police violence and massive protests against racial injustice. That's what's top of mind for many of us every day. This series is still organized around the pandemic as the central theme, but issues of inequity and justice will arise repeatedly in it, and we'll discuss the intersection of those two matters. In fact, today has been chosen as a day of shutdown academia. Not by us, by organizers outside nationally. And they're calling for no business as usual in universities and instead a day of education about racial justice. Racial justice was explicitly on the agenda already for today's session and for several other sessions in the pandemic. So we feel we are working in the spirit of the day. Over the course of the series, we'll also discuss the election, the recession, economic policy, epidemiology, and a range of other issues, but racial justice will certainly be central to it. I'm going to end with just a couple of practicalities and then turn things over to Deborah. Tufts students probably know this, but almost all of you, but you should register through Canvas, our course platform, as if this was a course. It's not actually a course, it's a series, but you should register as if it was a course. You can get a certificate of completion if you attend at least 6 of the 8 sessions and complete a feedback survey after each session, which you'll get quickly after the session. And we need your feedback because we want to improve the series as it goes along. And other members of the Tufts community are watching the webinars, but not through Canvas. Every Wednesday Zoom call, we're going to offer a mix of content. It'll be different every week, plus there'll be different things during each session. There'll be a lot of diversity. We'll tend to add more interactive features over time. We have just a few very mild interactive features for today. It'll get more interactive. We're building that out. Today, under the heading of interaction, today sometimes you will see a Q&A window where you can type questions for the speakers. At other times, you'll be invited to type responses in the chat window and everybody will be able to see the responses. So if you have a question at any time, please submit it via the Q&A feature. Don't use the chat. The chat will be temporarily disabled until later in the session. The Q&As are seen by our team, and we will sometimes have to pick some of them because we'll get too many to ask in time. So your Q&A might get asked. It might get read out to the panelists. If you're able, at times when you're able to put something in the chat window, everyone will see that. And so finally, just before I turn it over to Deborah, this is something new for us, as it is for you. We've never done this before. It's going to have its, well, it's an experiment. It's going to change. We're really serious about your feedback. I'm sure next time will be different than this time, partly because we planned it that way, but partly because we'll be looking for your feedback. We take your feedback seriously. Also, we'd ask for a little bit of patience with us. it's actually pretty complicated to have a whole bunch of different speakers appearing and disappearing in different features on Zoom when everything's remote and everybody's got other things on their plate. So I anticipate some moments of waiting for a minute for somebody to get their video started or something. And so we appreciate your patience with that. This is not quite cable news, but we're trying to produce a smoothly designed session for you. So with that again, let me say heartily welcome to this conversation. I'm looking forward to it. And I will turn things over to my colleague, Deborah Donahue-Keegan.
Let's see. Thank you so much, Peter. It's been a wonderful partnership so far, and I'm sure it will continue to be. And I also want to thank the Tisch College Dean, Alan Solomont, and the board members, Simon Rosenberg, for crucial encouragement to launch this webinar series. And thanks also to all of the students who have given some really crucial feedback and ideas for how we can conceptualize this webinar series. So as Peter said, today we will explore why developing racial literacy is vital to the work for racial and social justice, and how and why social and emotional resilience is vital to this process. And we'll also be looking at, of course, how we can develop our own well-being and emotional resilience. So I'm going to share my slides now. All right, there we go. All right, so here we have a slide on the 6 domains of resilience. And resilience means having the capacity to positively adapt to adversity and thrive. And so it's more than just bouncing back, it's about bouncing forward. This heuristic that you see on the screen is based on a predictive 6-factor resilience scale that's based on research that shows how health hygiene factors such as exercise, healthy nutrition, and sleep are fundamental components of overall psychological resilience, well-being, and healthy adaptation to adversity. And findings suggest that health hygiene factors are a fundamental component of overall psychological resilience and well-being. And also show how emotion regulation is correlated with higher levels of resilience and healthy adaptation to stress, uncertainty, and adverse circumstances, and is linked to adaptive collaboration and problem solving, and grounds us in a sense of vision and purpose. So on the screen is a quote from Dr. Mary Helen Immordino-Yang, who's an affective social neuroscientist. And she was actually at Tufts back in March 5th. And her work builds on the work of many social neuroscientists that shows that emotion and cognition are inextricably linked, that emotions such as anger, fear, happiness, and sadness are cognitive and physiological processes that involve both the body and the mind. And so we're bringing this in at this point to convey that this webinar series is you'll be getting a lot of information, a lot of resources, and hearing different perspectives. This will be very stimulating intellectually, but also we are going to very intentionally and explicitly look at the emotional, social and emotional dimensions of all of the topics that we're going to cover. So emotion in recent decades through technological advances, social neuroscience research has really given so much evidence on this inextricable link between emotion and cognition, and that emotion is embodied. Yet in our society, the tendency is still to view emotions as separate from thinking, and even as a deterrent to rational thought. We also tend to view attention to emotion as soft or touchy-feely, or just feminine. And we're not taught about how we tend to view emotions in these binary terms as either positive or negative. And we learn ways to avoid strong emotions, especially those that are unpleasant, such as sadness and anger. So the goal is that is to develop a sense of emotional literacy, to see how the strong emotions that we experience, that there can be an overlay and many emotions that are part of our experience of this strong emotion that we might identify. So emotion regulation skills are not soft skills. They're essential for resilience and well-being and thriving in all aspects of life, to help us move from hopelessness, fear, and frustration to courage, engagement, innovation, and synchronicity, which are the 7 levels of personal, group, and organizational effectiveness. As Brian Stevenson, the author of Just Mercy, which is now a film freely available, um, as Stevenson writes, hopelessness is the enemy of justice. Injustice prevails where hopelessness persists. And so hope is our requirement. It's our superpower. So emotions are complicated and fluid. And the more that we develop emotional literacy by becoming aware of, I'm going to go back to this one, by becoming aware of and acknowledging our emotions and becoming curious about the layers and nuances, the more that we can regulate and manage our strong emotions and see them as information for us to help us to identify what matters to us, what we value, what we care about and need, rather than being ruled by and overwhelmed by them. So in naming strong, unpleasant emotions, we can help to tame their hold on us and learn how to tolerate discomfort within ourselves and in relationship with and to others, those with very different social identities from us, those with very different ideological perspectives. So it helps us to develop that tolerance, and um, and do so with more compassion for ourselves and for others. And we can better validate the experiences of others and learn to co-regulate in service of better communication, collaboration, and problem solving together. Um, so here is a wonderful term. It's called emotional agility. And it was coined by Susan David. Over on this slide, you can see the book that she wrote. It was published in 2016. So emotional agility is a process that enables us to navigate life's twists and turns with self-acceptance, clear-sightedness, and an open mind. The process isn't about ignoring difficult emotions and thoughts. It's about holding these emotions and thoughts loosely, facing them courageously and compassionately, and then moving past them to ignite change. Social and emotional learning is a field, and it has been in development and really burgeoning since the mid 1990s. And it is the process through which we acquire and effectively apply knowledge, attitudes, skills necessary to understand and regulate our emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. And there are 5 core competencies of social and emotional learning, which you can see in the castle wheel developed by the Collaborative for Academic Social and Emotional Learning. So I'm just going to go through these slides quickly, and then I'll pass it on to Ryan Rideau. So the road to equity and social and racial justice is paved with emotions. And we need social and emotional stamina or resilience to manage our fight or flight response when addressing social inequities and structural racialization. And here's a practice that I'll introduce quickly here. Just keep the slide up, but we will go back to this as we bring in mindfulness practices introduced for you to all consider using in your lives. So we'll come back to this. And so here's a slide. What I invite all of you to do is, as we're transitioning from one speaker to another, to take time to focus on your breath, to breathe very intentionally, and trying to have an even longer exhale. So with this, I will now turn it over to Ryan Rideau. who is a wonderful colleague. He is an associate director at the Center for the Enhancement of Learning and Teaching at Tufts. And so Ryan is going to talk with us about social and emotional learning, equity, and developing racial literacy.
All right, thank you so much, Deborah, and thank you all for being here today in this inaugural session. I'm really honored and excited to be here and be in this space with everyone today. It's just a true honor. I think this is such an important initiative and just an important time for all of us to come together to really discuss these issues and just be in a space together. So thank you all. As Deborah mentioned, my name is Ryan Rideau. I'm the Associate Director for Teaching, Learning, and Inclusion at the Center for the Enhancement of Learning and Teaching at Tufts. And in my role, I support faculty members to create inclusive and equitable learning spaces for our students here at Tufts. I just want to share a little bit of how I come to this work, because I think it's important to frame who I am, how I came to this space, as you can get a better sense of what kind of things I'm thinking about, what things I'm offering, and what things I might be missing throughout this course as well. So I'm going to share the screen a little bit. All right, so as I mentioned, so I come to this work based on my own personal experience as someone who grew up as a Black male in the United States, who has experienced racism, systemic racism, and also a sheer passion for the classroom experience and learning opportunities. I've been in those spaces where I felt marginalized, isolated, and I think I don't belong in a classroom. But I also have been in those spaces that have been very empowering for me, where I can bring my whole self to that room. I can contribute. I feel a sense of camaraderie with my colleagues, with the faculty member, with the instructor. And so it's through that experience that I came to this work of really supporting faculty members. I think that education, the way we can support equity, racial literacy, social emotional learning can be a great opportunity to enhance these spaces in our educational institutions, but also to take this outside of that work as well. And so I'm really passionate about this work, and I'm excited to be able to share that with you a little bit today. So as we begin, I want to first acknowledge the moment, as Peter did at the beginning, and Deborah has as well. We're in a particular moment in time, and we're thinking about systemic structural racism. You know, we're impacted. We're seeing images of state and police violence against Black and Brown communities. We are seeing protests. And if you're anything like me, this has brought a range of different emotions for you. It brings heartache. You sometimes bringing back traumatic experiences, feelings of watching death, but also brings senses of hope and of things where we may be able to dismantle systems of racism. They're working to achieve a better society for all of us. And so for me, social emotional learning has really been important just to navigate my own awareness of self, my own experiences, sharing those with others, and we come to a space where I can move forward with the work that I'm doing and need to do within this space. And so I just want to acknowledge that I know this can be a difficult moment, and all of us are experiencing different things, some of this more closely than others. But I think this is part of this process, right? And this moment offers us particular time to do and engage in this work, and why we might need it more than ever. I just want to lay out a few things when we talk about social emotional learning and equity, just a few principles. And I'm pulling this from the National Equity Project here as well. Social emotional learning cannot be separated from equity, race, and sociocultural contexts. So when we're talking about things like self-awareness and self-management, we need to think about the ways that we're impacted by discrimination, racism, or how we witness it. We can't separate our own learning from those experiences. All of this learning takes place in a context, right? Right now, we are in a particular context, and we think about it. For many of us, I would suggest that we may have had changes in our feelings based on the past 2 to 3 weeks, right? We may not have been at the same place as where we were previously, and that's okay, and that's good. But I think that when we're talking about social emotional learning, it always must be couched within these particular contexts as well. So that social emotional learning can offer possibilities to acknowledge and provide healing for the ways we've all been impacted for racism. I talked a little bit about my own experience and how I've had to come process and recognize what's happening in my own body and what's happening in my own experiences by what's taken place. And I think that social emotional learning can and has shown to do this for many folks. And I think as we think about racism, systemic racism, and how even generational racism and trauma there's some spaces where social emotional learning can really help to do that work. I'm always reminded of the work of Howard Stevenson, actually Brian Stevenson's brother, who Deborah previously mentioned, in his work about how we are able to acknowledge the racism that we are stressful, how we acknowledge stressfully racial encounters, and how we can manage to cope through them, how we can acknowledge them within our spaces, how we can discuss them. And through this discussion, through reenacting, we can help to create a more possibilities and liberate ourselves from this trauma and the impact that we've done. And finally, what I acknowledge is social emotional learning can create inclusive spaces for marginalized students. And this is something that I'm whole passionate about in my own work, and I try to lead within our work with faculty members and even in discussions with students within these spaces, because it allows us to bring our whole selves into these spaces and bring forward some discussions that are the realities that most impact all of us there. Deborah laid out some of the 5 skills of social emotional learning, and I just want to expand upon those briefly in terms of the relationship to equity. So we talked about self-management, but we also need to recognize when we're talking about self-management, it allows us to think about the ways that we're able to cope with discrimination and prejudice, how we as individuals are able to address that when we witness it, when we experience that. And so we can't separate that self-management component without the ways that we're able to experience the stress that come from dealing with racially stressful encounters. We talk about social awareness, being aware of where we are in a particular context, who's in the room. Can I bring myself to this space? Is this a space where I feel like I can belong? What's happening within my within my own body as I'm being encroached in this situation? As a personal anecdote, I know, and have done this throughout my life, but I continue to do this. When I enter a space, I often will look around to see if there's other people who look like me. Is this a space where I feel like they might understand a little bit more about me? Do I not? Right? And so it's recognizing, what am I thinking in that moment? What's happening to my body within that space? And so helping to foster those self-awareness skills of all of us within that is an important component of this. Relationship skills. So how are we able to interact with others? How can we develop those cultural competencies, develop a sense of cultural humility, where we're able to interact with others, know our place? We're not saying we need to know everything about every group or every group of people, but able to have some sense of recognizing what we can offer, what things we might be missing from our own identities as well, and how we can better interact and shape our relationships with others as well. Right? So we also have responsible decision making, where we're thinking about identifying solutions to problems, right? But we also want to make sure that we're thinking about those of us who may be silenced, who maybe don't have a voice. How do we create decisions that are mutually beneficial for all of us in this space, right? And so again, thinking about those equity considerations as well as we're making our decisions. And finally, self-awareness as well. And so again, thinking about our own biases, our own positionalities. I led talking about my own experience. And I think that's important for us to continue to do that work, but also recognizing what things I might be missing from that space. I can give you my own perspective, how I've lived and experienced the world, but it doesn't mean I understand what everybody's experienced. And I think that's true for all of us. And the more we can do that work, the better. That's right. Not allowing. Uh-oh, it's not allowing me to. I can't move the next slide. All right, here we go. All right, so what can we do? And so when I'm working with faculty members, there's a few points that I try to stress here in these interactions. So first, I don't know why it's not. Okay, one, we need to recognize resilience, growth, and change. Deborah talked about resilience, and I think this is really key for all of us, right? As I mentioned before, where we began may not be where we end up. And that we need to think about the ways that we can foster ideas that allow all of us to continue to manage those stressful encounters, manage racism, manage those systemic forms of violence and oppression that many of us may experience, right? And sometimes that may lead us to a space that it could be a sense of empowerment for all of us. And so it's important that we continue to recognize our abilities and capacity to do this work and foster those spaces that allow us to do that as well. I think we always need to discuss race, racism, and oppression. It's something I always try to stress with people. It's not enough. We can't ignore this. Sometimes I often hear over people, well, if I talk about race, am I just highlighting something that maybe uncomfortable, or I just want to treat everybody the same. And I would actually argue this is probably the wrong approach to have. We always need to discuss race, racism, and oppression because we live in a context and society where race, racism are drivers for so many things that we see. Many of us aren't able to experience and think about how we live in a world without considering race as a leader for that, as a driver for how we experience those spaces. And so I think that we need to talk about them all the time. This may be uncomfortable for some, and I recognize that, particularly for some of us that may have been raised where this is not something comfortable we talk about, or we don't want to talk about it. But I encourage us to take that leap, to have those conversations about race, because this will open up the spaces for all of us to have that healing, to have that growth that is so necessary. And yes, mistakes will be made. I will make mistakes. We'll all make mistakes. But I think it's key that we just become comfortable with those mistakes as an opportunity for learning and growth. I want to mention practice cultural humility as well. And I think when we're talking about cultural humility, it's important that we're talking about listening to others. We're acknowledging that we don't have all the answers, that the perspectives and ideas of others are valid. And sometimes it's okay, I should just listen to what that experience is, or try to imagine what others may be experiencing. It's a lifelong commitment. It doesn't mean we're always going to develop to know every little skill or a checklist of skills to do, but it's a way of how of being where we can sit there and acknowledge that others have something to tell us. And maybe it's my place to listen to that so I can be better informed about how others are experiencing the world too. And finally, telling our stories. I believe that storytelling is a really important mechanism for how we can achieve healing. And I think it's important for all of us to try to share our stories. Now, I'm not asking to share stories maybe that we're not ready to talk about or maybe uncomfortable in those spaces. But when we are, and many of us do, it's important to share who we are, where we came from, what are those beliefs, what informed who we are today. To continue to do that work and discuss those with others. I think it is through those that we get to learn so much from our experiences, and we can bring those different perspectives that have often been silenced and marginalized into many aspects of our society. And so I encourage us to tell stories. I think they make for a great way to engage with others as well. And so I hope, and this is partially why I led off telling a little bit about who I am and my story as well. And I hope as we continue in this course that you have opportunities to do the same. I just want to conclude with a quote. If there's one thing you're going to take away from what I mentioned, this is a quote again from the National Equity Project, and it's that all learning is social and emotional, and all learning is mediated by relationships that sit in the socio-political and racialized context. Right? So that's a lot, and I hope you will be able to take that with you as you move forward. All right, so thank you, and I'm going to turn over. I think we have a question here from Derrick. So I want to turn it over to him.
Hey, Ryan.
Hi, Derrick.
And hi to all of you that are watching. My name is Derrick Sosa, rising senior at Tufts studying environmental health engineering with a concentration in public health. So as a first generation low income student of color on campus, there have been many times where I have felt isolated due to my background, both in and out of the classroom, whether it be being the only student of color in the classroom and not feeling support from a professor, or feeling like the outcast in some group projects. I feel like I can echo the voice of many students like me at Tufts by saying that we have felt unheard, unappreciated, and unsupported for many periods of time on campus. And with the current climate in the United States and gladly around the world, opening the eyes to many people on the systemic oppression of Black people and people of color in this country, I feel like it is important to enact substantial change on this campus as well, starting from the top. So I was wondering what you had to say about how faculty and staff can be a focal point in making campus a more accessible and inviting place for students like me, as well as more in depth about your role in not only helping train staff, but also the change you want to see on this campus and on other similar campuses around the nation.
Well, thank you, Derrick, for your question, and thank you for sharing your experience. Unfortunately, I've worked at several campuses at this point, and your story is all too common and something that we've seen. And again, some of my motivation for doing this work. So I want to thank you for sharing that. One thing I will say, I think too, is that again, as I just mentioned, this story is all too common, which means we see this at many opportunities. And I think this leads us to question what is happening at our institutions and why we continue to see the same stories told over and over from students of color, from first-gen students. And I think we need to think about, maybe on a larger scale, what are some of the structures and systems that we have in place that keep reproducing some of these inequities? And so that's the first place to begin. I often have to think about on a large level about what is the source of the problem. So to me, I think there's this large scale problems that we can maybe need to rethink about how we do higher ed, or rethink some of the assumptions we had. and to go back. And so this is something I try to, starting with faculty, I try to encourage them to think about their own fields, right? Why is it that we teach a certain way? Why is it, who is the people in our disciplines? Who's represented? Who's not? And why is it that it's not the case? Why is it that we see maybe some people with the same identities that are continuously represented, and we see people of other racialized identities that maybe not be as present in the literature? What does that tell us about our own disciplines, about how we are actually understanding what's taking place in the world? So I would encourage faculty to think about their own spaces, their own disciplines, and what they can really do, begin to question those assumptions that they're working with, in terms of, again, the teaching strategies, their own field. How are they engaging with scholars of color in their own field, the work that those folks are bringing in? Are they allowing those, amplifying those voices and those spaces and the work that they're doing into them? Because for me, that trickles down then to what happens with the student experiences. If we're able to get more folks of color in the faculty ranks to share their work, who feel like they belong, that then goes to the students, where that becomes an everyday practice, right? It starts small and again it goes to the next level. And so I think that if we begin with that and then work our way down, that will help to lead us to a better idea. I think some of these things are really difficult, and this is some of the struggles that I know I have. There's no easy solution. A lot of it does start with some of these deeper revelations, and to continue to explore our own identities, our own ideas, and some of our deep inherited assumptions that we have about our work and the work that takes place in higher ed. And it really begins at that point that we can begin to do the work of really supporting students that have historically been marginalized and kept out of institutions like Tufts to doing that work. And so I hope to do this in terms of a long-term engagement process with many faculty. I recognize this may not always be satisfying, but I think this is true for everyone. We have to continue to think about, what is the long-term process of this involved? There is not going to be a quick solution. There is no magic one thing we can do. But there are small things we can take steps to along the way to get to that longer process. And as long as we allow for that continued reflection and those opportunities to really engage in those assumptions, I think that will translate to how we interact with students and thinking about the spaces that we can create so that we are bringing the knowledge and experiences of first-gen students, of students of color, of all marginalized students up to spaces where they feel valued, recognized, and heard within higher ed and Tufts at large. Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and thank you for your answer. And I agree with you. I hope that, especially with the job that you're doing, that we can create a more equitable space at Tufts, both in and out of the classroom.
Yeah, thanks. And I should say too, I think there's a lot of ways that all of us can help to do that work too, right? And so when we see something happen, it's important for all of us to challenge it too. If we notice something that doesn't seem right, that does seem inequity, don't be afraid to say something and mention it or engage into the conversation about what just happened. So oftentimes I know this can be tricky and uncomfortable for a lot of us to do, but I think that's an important role to do because it will require a lot of work on all of us to do, particularly folks who have more privileged identities and who are able to engage in that work with less risk. So I do want to encourage all of us to make sure that we're continuing to do that as well, because I do think it does require collective responses and action.
Thank you so much, Ryan. This was excellent, and thank you so much, Derrick, for sharing some of your story, Ryan for sharing some of your story, and to both of you being in conversation and all of the really vitally important points that you raised. So really, really grateful. Yeah, and so happy that we're colleagues and that we're been able to do a lot of this work together. So thank you so much. So for now, I would like to introduce Shelly Tygielski. And it is such an honor to bring her in and to have her part of this webinar. So we're really grateful. She is incredibly busy and so many demands on her time. Shelly is the founder of Pandemic of Love. It is a grassroots, volunteer-led mutual aid organization that now has 625 full-time volunteers around the globe. and has made 132,000 matches, over that, I think, at this point, between people and families in need, and patrons, with over 18.5 million in direct transactions since Shelly started this movement on March 14th, 2020. Shelly is the founder of, she is a modern life mindfulness organization, and sees herself as a self-care activist, deeply involved in trauma-informed healing practices, bringing those practices to communities that are affected by violence. And her work is really amazing. So Shelly, I warmly welcome you. And we're just so honored to have you here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thank you for allowing me to pop in. I really appreciate it. It's really great to be here with everyone. And I'd like to spend, I guess, my time speaking about how movements really are the culmination, in many cases, of a lot of hard work and building blocks that take place over time, over the years. I want to talk about the connection between the inner journey, the me, right? The journey to self, to the we, which is the connection to our community and our circles of influence, and then how we can further take that and move it into the us, the collective, which is really where movements happen. And there's this great timeline and connection between all of those things, because movements can't happen without first one individual having the introspective moment of the inner journey. Everything that's happening in our world today, some people might think it just suddenly popped up, or it was the result of one incident or one thing that happened. But the reality is that no, it's not. It's actually been the culmination of many, many events that have happened in different times, in different cities and locations, and to many different people. And it's just like this one environment that was ripe, where everybody, the journey of us, was able to culminate. And so Pandemic of Love was really started in a seminal moment on March 14th. And as Deborah mentioned, I'm a community activist. I am a leader in our community who teaches mindfulness. I'm a mindfulness teacher. And I have a community of meditation practitioners that is more or less, over about 15,000 individuals that engage with us at different times. Some more, some less, but the point is that, there's a community there that is able to lean on each other during good times and bad times. And that community was actually something that was born out of the need for connection, my own need for connection, my own inner journey. I was still in the corporate world. I was in the corporate world for 20 years before making the leap and leaving that world behind to fulfill my dream and follow my passion to become a full-time meditation teacher in 2016. And prior to that, the reason I made that decision was because I was, as the president of a mid-sized company with 2,400 employees, was feeling very isolated and lonely, and really wanted connection on a different level, not just on a professional level. And as a meditation practitioner, somebody that has been practicing for 2 decades, I decided to gather some girlfriends on a beach here in South Florida, which is where I'm located. And there were 12 of us who gathered on the beach on November 15th in 2015. And that community of 12 ultimately became this large movement of meditators, which is self-described. I didn't come up with this name, but is called the Sand Tribe. And it's basically this community that now, pre-pandemic, has been meeting for 4.5 years on Sunday mornings on the beach. And the reason that I'm telling you this is because, when you find yourself in positions of influence, whether it's in a smaller level within your homes or communities, or professionally, or at your community at large. When you have a platform or an audience or people that are looking up to you or looking to you for leadership and direction, it's a really great opportunity to sort of turn inward and think about what your role is in how you can be of service. It's a very good question to pose to ourselves. How can I be of service? And when the pandemic happened, I immediately defaulted to that question. How can I be of service right now? I see that there's a lot of fear that's bubbling up, righteously so, amongst the members of our community who are hourly wage workers, who already are struggling and living paycheck to paycheck, who are being told by our leadership in municipalities and statewide to stock up and to shelter in home. Some of these individuals can't do that because they can't afford to stock up. They could barely, like I said, afford to make ends meet every week. So there was a lot of fear that was bubbling up in our community. And I think evolutionarily, when we kind of look back at how human beings evolved, our reaction mode is usually fight or flight, right? We become fearful, and what happens? We default into either shutting down, we default into sort of running away, or we default into charging and taking things head on. But I think that as human beings now, who hopefully are continuing to evolve, we can evolve into different default modes. And that can happen through neuroplasticity, the fact that our brain can continue to create, synaptic connections that grow stronger and stronger. And I think that those default modes can move us, instead of from fight or flight, right, moving away from fear. When we feel fearful, we can maybe move into an empathy mode and then an action mode, and ask the questions of, how can I be of service right now? To myself and to others, of course. So when on March 14th, I started to see the impending and just inevitable wave that was coming to my state, to Florida, and that we were about to be shut down, I immediately knew that something had to be done. And I defaulted into that empathy action mode, instead of sort of just pausing and saying, this is really scary. And, how do I protect myself? And I kind of widened the scope a little bit. And I decided in that moment to create 2 forms, and to really latch onto one of the pillars of trauma-informed mindfulness, and one of the core principles and teachings that I work with a lot of self-justice organizations on, which is the concept of mutual aid. And mutual aid is not something that Pandemic of Love invented. It's not something I invented. It's been around for many, many, many years. It's been around since, the dawn of time, where, especially regardless of where you're from, what your background is, what culture you're from, I guarantee you that you had a grandparent or parent or somebody in your life that used the phrase in some variation back in the day. So back in the day, people used to know their neighbors. We knew who was in our community. When somebody got sick, it was just understood inherently that we have to, take care of the people that are less privileged in our communities. And so the concept of mutual aid is kind of taking us back into this principle of, back in the day, we have to take care of each other, the people in our community, because the concept of self-care is actually, I think, erroneously labeled. The word self is in there, which is very individualistic. But when we think about it even deeper, and we really look at how self-care can be successful, it has to be a pursuit that is communal. It has to be an effort that is done by many people in order for it to succeed. And so mutual aid is a way for us to take individuals in our community that are in great need, of anything. It doesn't just have to be financial. It could be transportation. It could be babysitting services. It could be meals. It could be, a number of things. And then find individuals within our community that have the capacity or the privilege to be able to fulfill that need. And having a mutual aid community formalized in the manner that Pandemic of Love basically has done makes it easier to do one of the hardest things that it is to do in this world, which is asking for help. People have a very challenging time. It doesn't matter, where you are on the socioeconomic spectrum or where you come from. Asking for help is the hardest thing sometimes to ever do, because you have to, in some ways, in your own kind of narrative internally, you're saying, I am not sufficient in some way, or I'm not enough. You're admitting that there's a gap there. But if you create these like formalized ways within your own communities where it becomes easier for people to ask for help, maybe that help is somehow confidential in some way that they're asking for help. It becomes easier to create these connections between individuals. So Pandemic of Love just simply started on March 14th around my kitchen table with this notion of, how do I formalize a way for people in need to, actually be able to ask for help, and to make sure that people who are able to provide that help can somehow, be connected with those individuals. And we just, as I said, started with 2 sheets, a give help form and a get help form. And the give help and the get help were just put on Google Forms. I'm not a technical from my local South Florida community. And what happened was that I just posted a video of it on my Facebook and Instagram page. And within 24 hours, things started to build momentum. And I think that the reason this is because, as I self-reflect and analyze, is definitely, of course, the timing, because it was pretty early on in the pandemic. And I think that there were a lot of people that were scared and needed help, but there were also a lot of people that were like, this is really frightening, but like, I really want to be in service. How can I be of service, right? And they didn't know how. There was no program, there was no organization, there was nothing available yet that made it easy for them to give. And then the second thing is that I think that, it just was a simple, very easy to understand concept of, so there's just 2 forms. I just have to pick one or the other. I'm either this person or that person. Great. Let me just do that. And I can connect directly with the individual that is helping me or that is in need, which is amazing, because that's been the ultimate byproduct of what Pandemic of Love does. Pandemic of Love matches an individual that says, I need help with groceries. I need help with diapers and wipes. I need help paying my rent this month, with individuals in their community, ideally, right? People that are in their zip code, or at least in their county, or maybe even in their state, with people who are able to fulfill that need, or at least partially fill that need. But more importantly, the most important byproduct of all this is that we connect those individuals directly. And what happens then? Human connection. Humans are hardwired for connection. And so in a time right now, especially when we were sheltering at home, when there seemed to be a lot of isolation and disconnection, at least physically from one another, this was really important. And it was important because for many, many people on both sides of the equation, the giver and the person in need, it was an opportunity to be seen and to feel heard, which I think that in these times that we're living in, and certainly in the last 4 years, when we seem to be talking at each other, not talking to each other, it was so important for individuals to actually feel like, wow, a perfect stranger cares about my problems, wants to help me, wants nothing in return, and there's no catch. And I can share my struggles with that individual, and that person can mindfully just listen to me. what an experience. And so the emails and the texts and the thank you letters that we started getting in return, they're so gratifying, because a lot of times they're not just based on this notion of, I got my bill paid, but actually I connected with this individual that is now my friend, or somebody that checks in on me on a weekly basis, somebody that I've now taken that connection to another level. People have exchanged, niceties, certainly, but we've had individuals who have sent care packages to each other. We've had individuals who had their bills paid, but have a talent, like they sing a song or they paint, send gifts to the individuals that gave them their faith, or restored their faith back in humanity, I should say. So the idea here is that, I think there's always an opportunity when we are in finding ourselves in a moment where we're standing at this like precipice of something really scary in life, to rise up, to actually ask that one question of, how can I be of service? And see what comes up for us in that moment. How can I be of service? It could lead you to so many different answers. And I think that if sometimes we just decide that we're not going to be caught in this analysis paralysis, where we start to think about, if I were to start to think about, well, how is this going to work? And maybe I should whiteboard it. And, maybe I need to build a platform, and maybe I need to first get volunteers. And, it would have been weeks and weeks later. Perhaps the concept never would have gotten off of the ground. And I think that sometimes we just need to, just go for it, and just know that, and trust that if we're doing something that is in service to others, that we can just trust sometimes that if it's coming from the best place, that the tiles will appear. There's got to be this really great balance between following our intuition and then also using all the skill sets that we've acquired over a lifetime, in school, at work, through our experiences, our life experiences, to be of service. So Pandemic of Love actually is still happening. It's still going strong. Many people have asked me, like, what comes next when the pandemic ends? And I said, well, the concept of mutual aid, as I said, didn't start before me, with me. It started before me, and it's going to continue long after. And so the idea that we've, sort of started building on very early on was this concept of micro communities. Because if we can create mutual aid communities in communities around the country and around the world, as I said, they can be sustainable long after the pandemic is over. Just like there is a city hall in every single city in this country, imagine if there was some form of institutionalized or formal mutual aid community that existed in every single city in this country. Wouldn't that be something? Wouldn't it be amazing to think about the equity that could really happen, the distribution of wealth? And when I say wealth, I don't just mean money. I just mean the distribution of how many people have needs that are not met on a daily basis. And there were so many needs that we've learned about over the last, 8 to 12 weeks that you don't even really hear about on the news. You might just automatically default and think about, people are going to need help with rent, or they're going to need help with food, of course. But one really great example, which is actually pretty sad, is that our organization has helped pay for a lot of funerals, because there are a lot of individuals that don't qualify if their income level is below a certain level that is dictated by the state. They don't qualify for the subsidies because they're maybe undocumented workers, or they are individuals that for one reason or another just can't fill out the paperwork or what have you. And so it's a travesty, because a lot of individuals have turned to our organization to say, hey, we we just lost this family member. I lost my dad, I lost my brother, my sister, my mom, and I can't reclaim the body. So we have been able to, pay for cremations and funerals, and to make sure that these individuals have some dignity, and make sure that they have the respect at the end of their life, and that their family is able to pay respects to them and honor them in such a way. But that's like a need that nobody really even thinks about, So I think it's really important to kind of bring this down to the micro community level, because every community is different. Every community has different needs. In communities now that have started Pandemic of Love chapters, where there's been a lot of layoffs, where they're experiencing 20, sometimes 30% unemployment. There's a county in Massachusetts, for example, that has a lot of different retreat centers and summer camps and things like that, that recently laid off hundreds of individuals because of the pandemic and shutting down, et cetera. And those individuals, their needs are things like, hey, I've been employed for 20 years and I don't have a resume because I never thought I'd need one. So one of the ways that Pandemic of Love in that community is assisting those individuals is they've identified that people need help with career counseling and with development of resumes and interviewing skills and things like that. And certainly there are people in the communities who can offer that. So it's just this beautiful formalization of identification of things that are required and needed in order to live a fulfilling and full life, and to obviously have first your Maslow's hierarchy of needs met, but then beyond that, understanding that each of us has privilege. Even if we can't pay our rent, for example, we may be able to pay it forward by taking care of somebody's kids or walking their dogs or cutting their lawn or doing something, right? So that's the concept of creating community. And that's the beautiful part, I think, that can be really sustainable beyond the pandemic in this new world that we're emerging into.
Shelly, thank you so much. It's so inspiring. And I just love how you touch on the ways that we can shift our default mode, and that tapping into leveraging the empathy mode is so important for this work. And then all of the emotions involved in it, it's gratifying and it's, it's sad, there's anger, as you think about systemic dimensions of this. But the empathy and compassion is so evident in all of the work that you do. And just a quick question before we sign off, I'm wondering how Tufts students or members of the Tufts community could be involved with Pandemic of Love.
Sure. So there's a number of different ways. We actually have several chapters in different counties, and then also in Boston and Cambridge and just in different cities throughout. But we also have countywide mutual aid Pandemic of Love chapters in Massachusetts. But we also have partnered with a lot of different organizations and universities to create their own kind of mutual aid network. So one idea is that certainly if there are 5 to 7 Tufts students who want to be trained and want to create the Tufts Pandemic of Love chapter, it's something that we can basically help to get off the ground for them and train them, and they could bring them into the fold as part of the community of now over 650 volunteers that we have. And then the other way is to donate your time to become a matcher or a vetter, somebody who vets, individuals in need for one of the other chapters, whether it's in your hometown, wherever you're from, whether it is where you are presently in the present moment, but just to give your time to an organization to help with that, it would be incredible as well. There's just so many opportunities in that sense. And so the easiest way to go ahead and fill out a form, if that's something you're interested in doing, is to go to pandemicoflove.com. And when you scroll down on the homepage, there's 3 links. It's Give Help, Get Help, and Get Involved. Just click on the Get Involved link, and you send an email with your information, and then somebody from our organization will get back to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shelly. So appreciate you being here
Thank
today.
you.
It's
Thank you
really
so
an
much.
honor. Okay, bye.
Bye.
All right, everyone. So now we are going to open up the chat. We have 2 reflection questions. Number 1, how are you feeling? And number 2, what has resonated with you the most so far during today's session? And you can choose to respond to both or just one, but we'll give you about 2-3 minutes for this. So we'll open up the chat, and then we'll just wait for the 3 minutes as everyone it responds in the comment section. So we have about a minute left, and I'll just read some of what I see coming in. I feel overwhelmed as if, let's see, what's resonated with me is how racial equity and justice is intertwined. I feel inspired and optimistic. The concept of mutual aid, pandemic of love is inspiring. Ryan's talk resonated with me. It's a lot to take in with listening to these different talks. It really helped to hear about emotional resilience. These are wonderful. Thank you. And as Peter said, we will have more opportunities for interaction, for discussion coming up in the weeks ahead, and also through the Canvas site, which we have set up for students. So right now I would like to introduce our next speaker, final speaker. Kawashima-Ginsberg is a wonderful colleague at Tisch College. Kay is the director of CIRCLE, the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, a nonpartisan independent research organization focused on youth civic engagement in the United States. So Kay, welcome. It's wonderful. I'm so happy that you're here to share your wisdom and your expertise.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for your reflection, everyone. It's really inspiring to see you all, and it's wonderful to meet you. So, Deborah, I think we can talk a little bit about sort of how at Tisch College, we really have this strong mission of preparing all students and hopefully young people outside of our school too, to prepare them for lifelong civic engagement and democratic engagement and make positive change in the society and our world. And the way I think about the connection between civic engagement and social emotional learning and equity is that essentially they're really not separable. So I'm going to present a slide here if I can figure it out. Give me a moment. Okay. Sorry about this, guys. Too many screens. Here you go. Okay. So if you can see the screen, what I'm showing is essentially a Venn diagram of social emotional learning, mindfulness, commitment to equality and justice, and civic action being the necessary forces to make positive change that are systemic, not just sort of a temporary change or just being kind. Those things are really important, but when I look at it through the civic lens, that's what we need. But in order to do that job well, we really need to front end the social emotional learning and equity as principles that cover all of civic learning experiences. And what I mean by that is that our learning experiences have to be upheld with the principles of equity and the ability to see each other and dignify each other for what they bring to the classroom. Historically, civic learning spaces haven't always done that. And the consequence has been dire, which is that sometimes we prepare students unequally depending on students' racial backgrounds, because we have practiced racism in the society for a long time, or that somebody may be really prepared with the civic knowledge and skills, but they don't have the right values in place. So they could even be harmful as they try to make changes that are good for them, but not for the system or the world we live in. The second thing I would say about the connection between those three is that the positive social change really need all three to come together. So when we think about the positive social change, we need diverse stakeholders that are different in their opinions and backgrounds, but also have perspectives that are just as valuable as one another's. And with that diversity, we can make decisions that are really thoughtful and good for each other. And in order to do that, we actually need to prepare everybody, regardless of background. So those two things of educating young people equally and fully with SEL and equity, and then coming together as a society with a lot of people that are able to practice those skills as they become civically engaged individuals is really important. The other thing that I want to talk about is just what Shelly said, which was so inspiring. And those look like acts of kindness and communal and mutual aid. But I think when we do that at scale, the way Shelly's doing with many, many colleagues around the country, then it can turn into movement. And movements change culture, the perception of how we see each other, regardless of who the backgrounds are, and what capacity we all have as people that can change society or take care of each other. And that culture, changing culture, is just as important, if not important, than systems change, like laws and institutions. I'm going to move to just another slide quickly. So we've been going through the social emotional learning wheel quite a bit today, but I want to now look at it with the civic lens, which is to say that when we look at the social emotional learning through this lens, we get to take a little bit of a bird's eye view about how the society supports individuals and how we support the change of our systems and culture in a way that's great for everybody. So for civic actors, it starts with civic knowledge. But in order to do this well, we can't just teach about institutions, but we also need to help young people understand how power works through institutions and culture. With that knowledge, we can practice different skills. So in SEL, the social awareness may be more about how people around you are feeling and thinking about things. But for civic lens, it might be also about critical consciousness. How does systemic racism, for example, affect everybody in your space here and now? And for example, responsible decision making, it might be also about deliberations, not just about making the choice that's good for me, but it's also about how is this choice that we're making together good for everybody? What should we do, not what should I do? And for just another example, self-awareness, which may be more about, being aware of your own body and controlling our own feeling. That might be self-awareness, self-management as SEL. But for civic lens, it might be also about recognizing our own privilege and thinking about what we can do to use that privilege. And if you're somebody that's marginalized or oppressed, it might be more about how to be self-compassion, how to practice compassion for each other and for themselves, and then still rise to systems that are really, really harming everybody in the space. So I'll stop there. Deborah, do you want to add anything?
To round out, to address the civic learning dimensions. And also, a few questions have come in about how one on a concern that emotional literacy research that we've cited has centered on white researchers and could lead to tone policing of people of color. That SEL has been dependent on the labor and sharing of trauma among Black and Brown people. And so some concerns about that. I'm really happy that that has been raised because these are really critical points. And I'm wondering if you have a response to that.
Yeah, and I think, this is where I'm often challenged because there's really no short-term fix to these, right? And that's why at Circle, we focus on K-12 education quite a bit because we have to really grow civic actors that can think from those people that have power and privilege to actually step back and then see everybody and make sure everybody's dignified in any space they show up in addition to sort of making sure everybody gets really strong learning experience. And to do that, we really need to change almost everything from instructors and teachers' competencies about racial literacy to students' resilience. But it's not just about resilience. The environment that we share as learners have to really support that resilience. We can't just ask people who are struggling to be resilient. And I think that's where we need to really co-create that learning experience instead of asking somebody that's struggling to do more work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm going to share my screen to have this up front and center. And Kay, thank you so much. I also want to bring Ryan in to respond to one of the questions that came up. And as Ryan's coming on, and then we will close in just a couple of minutes. So again, this is from Zaretta Hammond. We need social and emotional stamina to manage our fight or flight response when addressing social inequities and structural racialization, and that this work, especially as those who are white, this is a responsibility that we have, and it is an ongoing work. Ryan, so would you mind reading the question that came in and your response?
Yeah, so there were a few questions, and I know we're short on time, so I'll just share one. And so the question was, talking about race in America is all too often an uncomfortable conversation. You say that people should share their stories when they're comfortable doing so, but when then is it okay to share them? How will those who are uncomfortable sharing their stories experience that could potentially be incredibly positively influential and informative know when they should share them? If not, then when? And how do you suggest navigating that abstract boundary? And I think this is a really good question, and I think it's a tough one, right? And I wish there was a clear answer, but I think part of what it is one, finding that space when you are able to find comfortable, but kind of just building off of what Kay said a little bit too. It's a responsibility to build that environment that allows for that sharing of stories too, right? And that involves everybody sharing their stories, right? And again, I appreciate the comment before, not just those who are most marginalized or those who just have traumatic experience, but everybody sharing the spaces to do that work. And I don't want to sound like everyone has to do this or put on the spot, because I don't think that's necessarily required, and I would hate to force anyone to have to share that when they're not ready or comfortable to doing so. But we want to do so in a way that is empowering for the individual to do so. When you feel that you're able to be empowered by this experience, when you think that this can lead to change, and you think that sharing that can be a source towards that resilience, towards growth, towards empowerment, and the conditions are set right for you to do that, then I would encourage you to do so. then I think they should do that. So, but again, it works on many different fronts too, where others have the responsibility to create those conditions and create that space to do that, but never to forcing anyone to have to do that work as well. So I think that those both go together in hand. So I hope that addressed your question a little bit.
Ryan, thank you so much. So we have come to the end of session number 1, our kickoff session. Thank you so much, everyone, for being with us here today. We will put up on the Canvas site our information about the upcoming session for next week and sessions that will come after that. Thank you so much, everyone. It was wonderful to be with you, and we look forward to your input. Again, a survey will go out today to all of the students who are participating, and we ask you, please, we would love your input, so to fill that out as soon as possible. And those students who are getting the certificate of participation, there will be another reflection questionnaire that will go out. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your day.